We're here close to I-10 and Segan Lane at one of the busiest intersections in Baton Rouge, but we're on the grounds of the second oldest church parish in the city of Baton Rouge. Join us today as we explore the parish of St. George. We are here inside this beautiful new church at St. George, and I have as my guest today, Martin Hernandez. Martin is the Director of Administration and Facilities here in the parish, correct?
Correct.
And you've been here for quite a while, and you were totally involved with the building of this, which we're going to talk about, but it took 108 years to get to this new church, right?
St. George is a very old parish. We're one of the longest parishes in the Baton Rouge area as far as history goes. And so in 1908, a small chapel had already been built on this property and the parish was formed. And that church that was here in 1908 actually ended up being the first parish church and served this church for 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And then in the late 1950s, Father James Finnegan became pastor of St. George, and the St. George School was built for the first time in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so a gymnasium/church was built. The building was intended originally to be the gymnasium for the school, but temporarily was going to serve the parish as a church, as a worship facility, because they had outgrown the original church that had served the parish for almost 50 years. And that building served for over 50 years as well. In the 1980s, there was in need of some renovation, and so the parish had a long discussion as to what direction they wanted to go, and it was not a great economic time for the parish, and so they decided that it would be best to renovate the existing facility, and so they renovated, and it served for another 28 years. And so it's been 108 years since the establishment of St. George, and finally the parish was able to build from the ground up this facility, which is intended to be the worship space for our parish.
To last
For another 108 years, hopefully.
That's it.
Hopefully.
It's interesting, 108 years, and it was established in 1908, and that's being established as a parish. And when we talk about that, we mean that's when they're given a resident priest, because this community as a whole has been here since the late 1700s, because it was founded by Dutch and German settlers that came down the Mississippi River on a flatboat and landed at Manchac. And we know they talk about it in the New Orleans Archives records of a chapel being built at Klein Peter Station. And you and I were talking before we started taping, and they called them stations along the railroad when the railroad came through. So Klein Peter Station would have been somewhere in this area.
Around Segan Lane.
Right, because the railroad track is still there.
That's correct.
So although the exact location might not be there, it was common back in the 1800s, because churches were far and few between and we had mud roads, to have chapels on private property. So this chapel that has been researched in the New Orleans archives or mentioned in the 1800s would have been on the Klein Peter property, because it was the Klein Peters that donated this land for St. George originally, the widow of George Klein Peter, and that was in the late 1800s even then.
Right, and this was one of the highest pieces of property in East Baton Rouge Parish, and certainly a property that the Klein Peter family owned. And so it originally ended up being a burial spot. It was a cemetery in which the Klein Peter family would come, and they would gather for various funerals, and eventually a chapel was built to facilitate the funerals.
Which became the parish.
And then masses were celebrated in that chapel, and it became the first church for the parish.
Which you brought up a great point. The cemetery, before we go too far, this is, I was researching to make sure, but I'm pretty sure St. Joseph has a cemetery downtown, of course, which was our first parish for 100 years until this became our second parish in the city of Baton Rouge. But there are no other parishes within the city that have an active cemetery.
Right.
Y'all do.
So St. George is we're still the only active Catholic cemetery
in the
city of Baton Rouge. Our space is limited, and we're trying our best to accommodate as many as we can. It's limited now just to parishioners and for their burial needs here, but we're blessed to have that in a way, but it links back to our history.
It does. Totally relates to your history, because the whole reason for the widow of George Klein Peter to donate the land was how difficult it was for them to come from this far out and travel by muddy roads to get all the way to St. Joseph, which is now our cathedral.
Right.
And so in doing so, I think it was her son-in-law, who was actually a judge, that started a petition around
That's right.
1906.
That's right.
And all the people living in this area. And I mean, Segan Road was a dirt road until, I think, Father Finnegan's
Yeah,
day
back
and
in the
time. So until
1950s.
the 1950s, you're looking at a gravel road out here. But when we go back to the cemetery and we talk about it being the high ground, that's known just by the oaks that are on the ground. That
That's
has become y'all's mascot or your
Symbol.
symbol.
The main symbol of
Thank
our
you.
parish
Couldn't,
is the
couldn't
oak
get that
tree.
word out of here, out of me. And they're all over around here, but oak trees in the swamp, you have Bluebonnet Swamp not far from here, and then it goes down towards the river. Oak trees grow on the high ridges. So that's how they would know this was the
right.
high ground. And the oaks that are here are 200 years old. So they would have been here when that cemetery was established.
So the oak tree has become our tree of life, going back to the Old Testament, seeing the tree of life. And so we have adopted that as our tree of life, a symbol of God's love and providence that he provides to us through that tree.
And it's amazing because in researching this, in every book that we've got about St. George, as far back as I could find, the tree is on the cover or
That's right.
in the cover. So I don't know where along the line that they all adopted it, but it's so appropriate. I mean, even the photographs of the old original chapel had the oak trees around it.
That's right. It's a beautiful symbol, and it's a beautiful way for us to denote our parish plant. We now encompass probably 42 acres
Oh, wow.
of a large piece of property that has been added to several times from the original donation, and some have been bought along the way. But those oak trees are really still a symbol of God's providence, and also with the state of Louisiana, the oak trees all up and down the river give that
So classic.
stately, classic feel to it.
The decision to build this church, in part, had to do with the growth of the school, did it not? I mean, this is such a booming part of Baton Rouge, and y'all really do have a fabulous school. It's a blue ribbon school, but wasn't there some play in there or some decisions
Well,
that were related to the school?
St. George School has grown from its infancy in 1960 to the point that we're probably one of the largest, if not the largest, Catholic schools in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. And for the longest time, we officially began as a school of kindergarten, but we have so many young families. We now have over 3,400 families in our parish, with the average age being 37 years old. And so there's
Yeah.
a tremendous population of young families with children. And so the need for a Catholic school has been just exponential in this area. And also the desire for us to have a full-time pre-K program.
Yeah.
So we began at kindergarten. More and more schools were tending to begin with 4-year-olds in pre-K, but we had no facility to enable a full-time pre-K program. So part of the master planning that we did was taking a look at what our needs were for the school, but also as far as the parish goes, and realizing that probably the best spot for a pre-K building was going to be where the old church was, because it was right in the midst of the school grounds. And so in looking at all of our facilities here, a decision was made that we would build a new church, because the old church, was in serious need of repair, and it was also seemed to be not of adequate size to meet the needs of our growing parish. So a decision was made that we would build a new church on the property, and then take the location of the site of the old church and turn it into a pre-K for the school. So we did that. The church came first.
Right.
And we moved in, and once the church was dedicated, then the next part of that project, the master plan, was to demolish the old church and to build the pre-K building, which opened in August of 2018.
Right.
So we now have
1 year.
1,200 students in our school here at St. George, pre-K through 8th, 4 sections of every grade.
That's amazing, totally amazing. And I called the school, because I always like to verify my data. And that's pretty much, she was like, well, wait, let me see, because we just opened the pre-K, and she gave me the numbers. And yeah,
That's
it's
right.
amazing that it's that big. I was very surprised, but that's awesome. That's great.
So when we were
So-
when we were planning this church, I mean, this involved one of the things our pastor, Father Mike Shotzley, wanted to do was to involve the parishioners from the very beginning. And so when we went about selecting an architectural firm that would work with us, we wanted more than anything else to involve the parishioners and the parents of the school children in the planning process. So we had numerous parish meetings, town hall meetings to discuss our progress, to look at what are we looking for. If we're building a new church, what do we want that church to look like? And more we hear this sentiment from people, well, we want the church to have the look and the feel of a church.
Right.
Somewhat traditional, but at the same time make it functional to follow the guidelines of Vatican II, and the worship documents are there. And another important aspect is that we were realistic in seeing that the clergy shortage that we're suffering through in our diocese and throughout
Everywhere,
our country, how are we going to meet that in the future? And building a small church and hoping that you would have a priest that could celebrate 5, 6, 7, 8 masses on a weekend becomes impractical.
Yeah, impossible.
And so we decided to build a church. This church seats 1,200 people, so that if there ever comes a time where one priest would be limited in how many masses could be said on a weekend, we could do our best to fit as many parishioners into the church as we could. And so this church was built to seat 1,200 people. We have a mass chapel, daily mass chapel, that seats a little over 100 people now. And also with the population of the school and the old church we had, we were not able to fit all of the school children in for a school mass, where they were sitting in the cry room because there was not enough room for school mass. We'd have to bring in 150 chairs just to let everyone just sit down.
Right.
So at least all the school children can fit every week when we have school liturgy, comfortably fit in the church.
Well, y'all had, just in talking to you just now, on our little break, you were telling me the process in which y'all came up with all this fabulous artwork, design, everything that's in here. So tell us a little bit about
Well,
the
not
process.
only were we meeting with our parishioners, but we formed a building committee that we called an executive committee of people that were involved in architecture, and they're involved in interior design, and others who had been involved in church and church liturgy. And we decided that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Why don't we take a look and see what's being built around the country or even in our region? And one of the largest areas of Catholic growth in the South has been in the Galveston-Houston area. And so we spent 3 days, a group of us went to Houston, and we visited, I think, 9 or 10 churches that had been recently built in the Houston area. And after every visit to every church, we would get together and write down, what did we like, what didn't we like, what aspects of those churches do you think that we would like to incorporate, in our new church? And so several aspects of the design that we have here in this church were sort of gleaned from the beautiful churches that we saw in the Houston area.
Okay, great. Let's talk about some of the different aspects. I know one thing that strikes me, because I was telling you I went to a wedding in Houston, but the mosaics that are in the floor tell a story,
Right.
as well as just being absolutely beautiful. If you have not paid attention, if you've come here and wanted to not step on them, they're that beautiful artwork
Right.
in and of themselves. Now, the artist that did the mosaics, same artist that
Right.
did
Well,
the stained
part of the
glass, right?
artwork that we wanted here is that, as most artwork, whether it's stained glass windows, statuary, mosaics, all tell a catechetical story. And so we said, well, what is it we wanted to teach in our artwork here? And believe it or not, the symbolism we wanted to bring out was the 7 sacraments. That was the basics. That's what we're all about. That's what happens when we come together as a community to celebrate God's presence. We celebrate those 7 sacraments all in this worship space. So the mosaics here represent, and the windows,
Right.
represent the 7 sacraments. And so the 3 windows, the rose windows, celebrate the sacraments of initiation, of baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation, coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Those were our 3 primary, and then the other 4 sacraments are mosaics in the main aisle, representing the sacraments of vocation, matrimony, holy orders, representing the anointing of the sick and the healing that takes place in the anointing of the sick and also in reconciliation. And so Steve Wilson, who is a local artist here in Baton Rouge, was selected not only for his great ability to express biblical themes in glass, but also is just an excellent artist. And so he provided the artwork for the mosaics, and then those mosaics were handcrafted in Lebanon, where some of the oldest mosaics have been made for centuries and centuries, and so they were made in Lebanon and put in here. And then Steve Wilson designed the rest of the stained glass and installed them. They were made locally, created locally, and installed by him.
Really? Wow. Mm-hmm. I do know that the oak tree as well is when you enter
Another
the church,
mosaic
right?
is in the narthex, which represents our tree of life, and our establishment in 1908.
I thought that was beautiful when I saw it as well.
And then we have another mosaic in the Daily Mass Chapel, which is the pelican, the very similar symbol that is the state of Louisiana has adopted as a symbol, and the symbol of the pelican feeding her young. It goes back to European models. It used to be, and it still is, an expression of the Eucharist, how Christ sacrificed himself and said that I am the bread of life. Whoever eats this bread and drinks this blood will have life forever. And so the pelican, the piercing of her breast and feeding her young is very similar to and a symbolism of the Eucharist, of Christ giving his body and blood for our nourishment and our spiritual growth.
Two pieces of stained glass that we have not yet covered. One is the entrance coming into
So the
church.
entrance, when you come in the narthex, probably the largest window we have here, Steve Wilson named the sacrifice of the Lamb. And it's a symbolism that has a cross in it, but at the center of the cross is the sacrificial Lamb of Christ. And it was a window that originally wasn't in the plans for the church.
Oh, okay.
But, it's the space was there, but we didn't have the money for it, and it's sort of like we asked Steve to design the window, and perhaps through some providence of God, it will happen. And we had a donor who came forth at the last minute and said, "I'd like to provide that window."
Oh,
and
amazing,
so,
'cause it's
that
absolutely
window was put
gorgeous.
in. It's a stunning addition.
It is.
The sacrifice of the Lamb. And then between the altar, main altar, and our daily Mass chapel, there's a glass wall. And that's a very interesting piece because that highlights our tabernacle and actually the crucifix in the main altar as well.
Because it's different from the others.
Yeah. And the symbolism there kind of goes back to the story of the crucifixion. So we read in the Gospels how when Christ was crucified at the hour of his death, the earth quaked and the skies. There was an eclipse and the skies went dark and the curtain of the temple was torn. Mm-hmm. And so when the curtain of the temple was torn, it revealed the Holy of Holies. And so the symbolism of that glass is actually the tearing of the curtain of the temple, revealing of the Holy of the Holies. And so we go from the crucifix of Christ dying on the cross and his death pierced that veil, and opening of that tearing of the veil, revealing the tabernacle where we believe is the sacred presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Well, that window, for those of you, we're talking about it, but the way the church is designed, behind the main altar of the main church is
the daily
Mass Chapel. So that glass shares both sides.
That's correct.
Correct?
That's correct.
And that's where it's in that chapel that the Pelican mosaic is.
That's correct.
But when we were in there, I had never been in the daily chapel at the old St. George Church to see, if we can talk about real quick, although this is a new church and so much of it is new, there's a lot of the old that was brought.
Well, we wanted
with
to
it.
preserve
So,
as much.
Yes,
I mean,
of
we have
what was
a
there,
mixture of old and new in this new church, and number one, we wanted to preserve some of the liturgical pieces of the old church, and so the altar in the daily Mass chapel was used in the daily Mass chapel of our old church.
And I love it. I mean, you walk in, it's beautiful with the not to interrupt you, but
That's all right.
it captured my attention immediately.
We have the statues of the Blessed Mother and St. Joseph in the daily Mass chapel,
Right.
as well as a crucifix that was in the old church adorn the daily Mass chapel. In the main body of the church, the altar is the same altar we had in the original church, as well as the ambo, and they were reworked by Ford Thomas, who is a local artisan who helped build some of the furnishings, the newer furnishings we had. It was refurbished and brought back. And the new crucifix that we have was actually a hand-carved crucifix that we commissioned artists in Italy to make specifically for us.
That's amazing. Now, the tabernacle in the daily chapel, you were telling me, it resembles the design on it.
Ford Thomas also was able, just a very talented woodworker here in Baton Rouge, took that design, and so the tabernacle has a symbolism very similar to our church.
The look of the church.
But it's a very unique and sacred
Beautiful
spot for us to reserve the Eucharist.
It is. Now, you were also telling me, though, that we were talking about the relics that are in archives. Plenty of times, churches will call us asking about what relics are in their altar, and we don't necessarily have the paperwork if it was never deposited with us at the time. But y'all have different.
So in St. George Church,
and you have a plaque
That's
that identifies them.
So when St. George Church was dedicated by Bishop Munch in 2017, in the main altar was embedded a relic of Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta. And she was selected because of her connections to the Diocese of Baton Rouge. She came and she established a convent of her community that continues to work in our diocese today. And she made several visits to Baton Rouge. And so her relic is in the main altar of the church, and then a relic of St. John Newman, who is also an American saint, is in the altar in the daily Mass chapel.
You, through your various connections, were instrumental in procuring some of the statuary, or like the way of the cross. I think the bells. Am I correct on that?
Well, one of the goals that we had along the way when we were studying our church is we recognized that so many churches in our country had closed. I mean, this has been a phenomenon going on for many years, and so we wanted to do our best to try to procure, if we could, some statuary, some artifacts from older churches, if possible. And we were looking for bells. We wanted real bells in our church, and the cost of new bells was extraordinary.
Really?
And through some research, we were able to find some bells that were removed from a church in St. Louis about 10 years prior to us building this church. And so the Archbishop of St. Louis was willing to let go of those bells that were in storage, and Bishop Munch was instrumental in helping us get those here. Those bells were removed from storage. They were refurbished and put into our bell tower here. Those bells were cast in 1908 and 1910.
Oh my goodness!
So they had
significance.
A story that was told over the past is that we have a parishioner who actually lived in St. Louis as a child and went to this Holy Family Church and heard these bells ringing, and then they came and moved to Baton Rouge, and now the bells have new life at St. George, and so it's like the old homes come back.
And
here.
really, 1908. I mean, that's when y'all
the
started
parish
officially as
was
parish.
founded.
So
That's
that's amazing.
And the Stations of the Cross were procured. They were taken out of a church from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And they seem to match very well with the architectural style.
They do. Oh,
and
my
those
goodness.
those were refurbished, and we were able to go and give them a new home as well. And there's another artistic piece that comes from that 1908 to 1910 period of time. And so they served many years in a church. We don't know exactly what church. We know the Diocese of Allentown, but now they have found a new life here at St. George.
And besides being old, just the way in which y'all place them.
Right.
You see Stations of the Cross on the wall, but they're like in a little alcove with their own lighting, and it's so dramatic. No matter where you're sitting in the church, pretty much, you can see at least a few of them.
It's a wonderful devotion during Lent, and people pray and walk can meditate
Walk
on the
the way of the cross.
14
Yes, 'cause they're
ways.
large, too.
They're beautiful.
They're
really
beautiful.
beautiful and prayerful pieces.
So besides those, there's it's very interesting here in this church as well, the way that I see curved pews.
Right.
So
So
there's a reason for
the church
that.
is a traditional cruciform church, but we wanted to try to get as many people as we could close to the sanctuary. While the church is large, we can seat 800 to 900 people in the first half of the church, and so it's sort of a proven fact that we found out from other churches that radius pews are a way to more efficiently fit more people in a space
I would have never known
than
that.
the straight pews, and so we were able to have radius pews and probably 2/3 of the church, and then in the main body of the church here we have a combination of radius and curved and straight pews.
So were these made locally, or were they
The pews came
Is it
from a
Sherman
company
Brothers?
in Pennsylvania.
as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
these were made in an Amish community, believe it or not. Yes.
Wow. I had heard there was a story about the pews. I just didn't know what. They're beautiful. Even the
They
wood
came from
tones
New
look-
Holland, Pennsylvania, which is in the midst of Amish territory, and they made these pews, and they've been making radius pews for a number of years. They're beautiful, beautiful pieces of work.
It really is, and the whole church is so stunning, everything about it. Y'all have something that I've seen in Houston, I think I've seen it in Florida, and that is the ability also with the technology to be able to broadcast up songs that are not necessarily in the book, things like that.
So
correct?
we have
looked at that
we
too.
added technology, and one of the things we wanted to do is we have no cry room. That was one of the discussions we had prior to building the church. Should we or should we not have a cry room? And parents who had endured years of children in a cry room said that was one of their worst experiences as parents. And so the large narthex we tried to use as a quieting area for parents that have children. And so we use technology to broadcast the Mass live in the narthex with sound and pictures, plus they can watch through the windows. And then the screens we have in church enable us to go and to put announcements up, to assist in prayer. It's not meant to be a distraction, but it's part of what we as church are called to have an active participation in the Eucharist, that all of us are actively involved in the prayer. And so we sort of use that as a tool to assist in the active and full participation of
Oh,
the
it is.
congregation.
Yeah, the few times that I've been to Mass here, not being a parishioner, it's definitely an asset, to be able to, in my case, follow a song and not have to be fumbling for the page or whatever it was.
And that,
at the time that it was
technology
there.
now allows us to go and to broadcast live Mass every Sunday on our YouTube page as well.
Oh, speaking of the YouTube, we're getting short on time. I could keep. I see something in the corner of my eye that I wanted to talk about, but we're getting close here to our cutoff point. But you mentioned the St. George YouTube, WBRZ with John Pastrek, the Sunday Journal, I believe is the name of the show. The weekend that y'all opened, or right after you opened, he did 3 sequences about the church as well.
Correct.
And so I would encourage y'all to visit the St. George YouTube page and look up. It says WBRZ. John Pastrek St. George, and there's part 1, part 2, part 3, and just to see more and see in detail. I mean, it'll complement what we're doing. It's just a
Correct.
great way to see more about this absolutely beautiful space.
Right.
And I can't thank you enough, Martin, for being with us
Well,
today.
you're welcome. Thank you very much for
that
coming to visit
all
with
of our
us.
viewers can see this wonderful space. So
It was a
again,
pleasure
thank
having
you.
you. Come and visit us.